My mother trusted her new boyfriend with my son, so I exposed his abuse, uncovered his fake identity, and sent him to prison. On Friday evening, at St. Mary's Hospital's pediatric ward, Emily Thompson was finishing taking the temperature of her last patient. Her white nursing shoes made light sounds on the hallway floor as she headed toward the nurse's station. There was a lightness in her step that showed no fatigue. This was a habit she had developed 6 years ago when she became a single mother. She believed that showing weakness wouldn't be good for either her son, Ethan, or herself. "Emily, good job today. It was another long day, wasn't it?" her colleague Sandra called out to her. Emily smiled as she replied, "Yes, but Ethan is staying at Mom's house tonight. I should be able to sleep peacefully for the first time in a while." Emily's mother, Margaret, had been offering to look after Ethan on weekends for the past few months. Margaret had ended her 25-year marriage 6 months ago. The divorce had brought her liberation but also deep loneliness. Spending time with her grandson, Ethan, had become a great comfort for her. As Emily gripped her car keys, she thought about her mother. While Margaret put on a strong front, Emily couldn't miss the lonely expression that sometimes crossed her face. Lately, especially, she had been calling more frequently. Emily could painfully understand her mother's feelings as she wanted to talk about everyday events and tried to prolong their conversations. During the drive to her mother's house in the suburban residential area, Emily gazed out at the passing scenery and reflected. During her marriage, Margaret had been a devoted wife who supported her husband. Emily's father, James, ran a construction company, but was so absorbed in his work that he left all household matters entirely to Margaret. Margaret never complained and devoted herself to housework and childcare, playing the perfect wife at her husband's social gatherings. However, after Emily graduated from college and became independent, an unbridgeable gap developed between the couple. They had fewer common topics to discuss. James increasingly escaped into work, and Margaret began living empty days. Ultimately, Margaret's decision to initiate the divorce was a courageous one in its own way. When she parked in front of her mother's house, Ethan was waiting by the front door. His brown hair swayed in the wind, and his bright blue eyes sparkled as they reflected the setting sun. When Emily saw her son smile, the day's fatigue instantly vanished. She always thought she could overcome any difficulty for this child. "Mama!" Ethan jumped into his mother's arms. Emily hugged her son while smiling at Margaret, who came out from the entrance. "Good job today, Emily. How was your day?" Margaret warmly welcomed her daughter. Her hair was neatly styled, and she wore light makeup. After the divorce, she seemed to be gradually trying to reclaim her sense of self. It was busy but fulfilling. "How was Ethan?" "He was a very good boy. We did homework together, and we promised to bake cookies together next time," Margaret said, while gently patting her grandson's head. Ethan looked up at his mother happily. "Mama, I'm going to make chocolate chip cookies with Grandma." Emily breathed a sigh of relief. She understood how important Ethan's presence was to her mother. At the same time, the time with his grandmother was precious for her son, too. Emily felt sorry that she sometimes couldn't devote enough time to her son while being caught up in daily work. With Margaret taking care of him on weekends, Ethan received plenty of his grandmother's love, and Emily could also get a brief respite. "I'll come pick him up tomorrow morning," Emily said, giving her son a kiss. "Understood." "Ethan, let's make pancakes tomorrow." There was a lively ring in Margaret's voice that hadn't been heard in a long time. Looking at her mother's expression, Emily was once again convinced that this arrangement was good for both of them. However, about 3 weeks later, Emily began to notice subtle changes in her son's behavior. Ethan started to reluctantly visit his grandmother's house, something he used to look forward to. "Mama, can I stay home this Saturday?" Ethan asked hesitantly during dinner on Tuesday. His small hands gripped his fork as he poked at his meatballs. Emily carefully observed her son's expression. Instead of his usual bright smile, she saw a somewhat anxious shadow. "Why don't you want to see Grandma?" Emily asked gently. Ethan shrugged his shoulders and looked down. "Not really, but I want to be with Mama." That response warmed Emily's heart, while also giving her some unsettling feelings. However, with the fatigue from a long week of work accumulated, She didn't pursue her son's change of feelings deeply and simply interpreted it as him being clingy. "Ethan, Mama wants to be with you too, but Grandma is also looking forward to seeing you. Besides, Mama sometimes needs a break. You'll enjoy your time with Grandma, won't you?" Ethan nodded slightly, but his expression still showed he wasn't convinced. Emily stroked her son's head and decided to consider his reaction as either work stress or a temporary change due to his growth phase. The next afternoon, during her break at the hospital, Emily received a call from her mother. Margaret's voice was more animated than usual, and there was an excitement that suggested something special had happened. "Emily, about this Saturday, it looks like it's going to be a special day." "A special day?" Emily held the receiver to her ear while watching colleagues busily moving through the hallway. "Actually, I'm going to have a guest over. He's a wonderful person, and I'm sure Ethan will like him too. We're planning to have dinner together." Margaret's voice had a feminine sparkle that hadn't been heard in a long time. Emily took a moment to understand the meaning of her mother's words. "A guest, you mean?" "A man named Robert McNeil. He's very gentlemanly and cultured. I met him at the library. We have common interests and our conversations are lively." Complex emotions swirled in Emily's heart. It was wonderful that her mother was trying to walk a new path in life. However, she also felt anxious about involving her son, especially remembering that Ethan had recently been reluctant to visit his grandmother's house. She began to suspect there might be some connection. "Mom, how long have you known this gentleman?" "About 2 months now. At first, it was just a coincidence that we sat next to each other at the library, but we started talking about the books we were reading. He's so knowledgeable that I feel sorry for taking up his time." Margaret's voice carried the bashfulness characteristic of a woman in love. Emily was torn between wanting her mother's happiness and worrying about her son's safety. "That's wonderful, Mom. But about Ethan, you don't need to worry about Ethan. Robert likes children. He's met Ethan several times before and has been very kind to him." Emily was surprised. She didn't know that her son had already met this man several times. Why hadn't Ethan mentioned this? "Ethan hasn't said anything about Robert. Children are usually uninterested in adult relationships. Anyway, could you pick him up a little later on Saturday? I'd like to enjoy dinner leisurely." Emily couldn't find a reason to refuse Margaret's request. She thought about discussing her son's recent behavior, but hearing her mother's happy voice, she hesitated to bring up that topic. "All right, but if Ethan seems uncomfortable, I might come to pick him up earlier." "Of course, but I'm sure it will be a fun dinner." After hanging up, Emily returned to her afternoon shift with mixed feelings. She didn't quite understand why she felt complex emotions about her mother's new romantic relationship. Margaret had sacrificed herself for her husband for a long time. This time, Emily sincerely hoped her mother would be happy. However, when she thought about her son, her anxiety couldn't be dispelled. Ethan was a sensitive child who tended to pick up on changes in the emotions of adults around him. Emily couldn't judge what kind of impact his grandmother's new boyfriend's presence was having on him. That night, while putting Ethan to bed, Emily tried talking to her son again. "Ethan, what do you do when you play at Grandma's house?" Watch TV, read books?" Ethan's response was vague, and he didn't talk about specific things like he used to. Previously, he would excitedly tell her in detail about the cookies he made with his grandmother and the contents of books she read to him. "Do other guests ever come over?" Ethan stiffened for a moment. Then he answered in a small voice, "Sometimes Uncle Robert comes." "Uncle Robert? What kind of person is he?" "A big person. He talks with Grandma." He didn't want to talk about anything more. Emily placed her hand on her son's shoulder. "Ethan, if anything unpleasant happens, tell Mama about it. Anything at all." Ethan nodded, but there was an expression in his eyes as if he wanted to say something. However, in the end, he said nothing and kissed his mother goodnight before falling asleep. On Friday night, Emily was thinking about the next day's plans. Normally, she would take Ethan to her mother's house on Saturday morning and pick him up on Sunday afternoon. However, this time, because of the special dinner, Ethan would be at his grandmother's house until late at night. Emily hoped her anxiety was misplaced. She didn't want to interfere with her mother's happiness. At the same time, she was certain that her son's safety and well-being were the top priority. She decided to pick him up a little earlier than planned the next evening. If Ethan seemed uncomfortable, she could take him home immediately. On Saturday morning, when taking Ethan to her mother's house, Emily carefully observed Margaret's condition. Her mother was clearly different from usual. She had carefully styled her hair, applied light makeup, and was wearing a new blouse. Her eyes had a sparkle mixed with anticipation and nervousness. "It's a special day today," Emily said with a smile. "Yes, I'm very much looking forward to it. Robert is scheduled to come around 6. Ethan will have dinner with us too." Margaret took her grandson's hand and spoke to him gently. "Ethan, we're having a special guest today. Please be on your best behavior." Ethan nodded slightly, but his expression didn't have the smile it used to have. Emily hugged her son and whispered in his ear, "If anything happens, call Mama right away." As she said this, she questioned whether she was being overprotective. Emily's heart continued to waver between wanting to celebrate her mother's new beginning and her instinct to protect her son. On Sunday morning, Emily woke up before her alarm clock rang. The night before, she had heard from her mother by phone that dinner had run longer than expected, so she had postponed picking up Ethan until this morning. Margaret's voice was in high spirits, excitedly talking about how wonderful dinner with Robert had been. While Emily was relieved by her mother's happy demeanor, she felt a small anxiety about not being able to hear her son's voice. While drinking her morning coffee, Emily was enjoying a leisurely morning for the first time in a while. Usually at this time she would be busily preparing Ethan's breakfast and helping him get dressed. In the kitchen, wrapped in silence, she was thinking about her mother's new life. While she still had complex feelings about Margaret dating again, her desire for her mother's happiness was winning. Around 9 in the morning, Emily began preparing to go to her mother's house. She expected that Ethan had surely spent enjoyable time with his grandmother and would have many new stories to tell her. However, when she arrived at her mother's house and rang the doorbell, she couldn't see Ethan, who would usually run to the entrance. When Margaret opened the door, her expression still carried traces of last night's excitement, but there was also a somewhat tired shadow. "Good morning, Emily. You're a little early. Is Ethan still sleeping?" "Yes. He stayed up a little late last night. But let's wake him up now." Margaret led Emily into the living room. On the table, she could see remnants of the previous night's special dinner, an expensive-looking wine bottle, used candlesticks, and fine dishes that weren't usually used, were still left uncleared. "It looks like you had a lovely dinner," Emily said with a smile. "It really was wonderful. Robert was a perfect gentleman, and he was very kind to Ethan too. They played games together, and he read books to him." Margaret's eyes were shining, but Emily felt something was off. Her mother's story and her son's recent behavior just didn't connect. "I'll go wake up Ethan." Emily listened to Margaret's footsteps going upstairs. Looking around the living room, everything seemed orderly, but there was an inexplicable tension in the air. After a while, she heard voices from upstairs. They were unusual voices. Ethan, are you all right?" There was clear agitation in Margaret's voice. Emily hurried up the stairs. In the guest room, Margaret was shaking the shoulders of Ethan, who was curled up on the bed. "Ethan, Mama is here. Wake up." Ethan slowly sat up, but at that moment, his small hand pressed against his head, showing an expression twisted with pain. "Mama, my head hurts." Ethan's voice was weak, completely different from his usual energetic voice. Emily rushed to her son's side, knelt down and looked into his face. Ethan's face was pale, and tears were welling up in his eyes. "Where does it hurt?" Emily tried to maintain her composure as a nurse, but her fear as a mother was making her heart beat violently. Ethan pressed the left side of his head while answering in a small voice. "Here, it hurts so much." "Mama, help me." At that moment, Emily found something like a thin blue-purple bruise among her son's hair. It was clearly something that had been made recently, and it was different from the kind of scrape that would result from falling. Her experience as a nurse suggested the worst possibility. "Mom, we need to go to the hospital right away," Emily said in a trembling voice. Margaret stood there with a confused expression. But it's probably just a cold or something. No, this isn't an ordinary headache. We need to go to the hospital immediately. Emily carefully picked up Ethan. Her son's body felt heavier than usual and was limp. In the car, Ethan was moaning softly on his mother's lap. "Mama, I feel sick." Emily placed her hand on her son's forehead. He didn't have much of a fever, but something was clearly wrong. While driving, she called the emergency department at St. Mary's Hospital where she worked. "This is Emily Thompson. I'm a nurse in pediatrics. It's about my 6-year-old son. There's a possibility of head trauma. I'm coming right away." When they arrived at the hospital, Emily's colleagues responded quickly. Ethan was taken to a pediatric examination room, and Dr. Jenkins conducted the examination. Emily waited in the hallway, desperately thinking about what could have happened to her son. 30 minutes later, Dr. Jenkins came out of the examination room. His expression was serious. "Emily, let's talk for a moment." They moved to an empty consultation room. Dr. Jenkins sat in a chair and faced Emily. "We performed a CT scan on Ethan's head. He shows symptoms of a mild concussion. And there's a clear contusion on his scalp." Emily's heart beat violently. "A contusion?" "Yes. This type of injury usually occurs when someone hits their head hard against something, or when someone hits their head with something." "Emily, do you have any idea what might have happened to Ethan?" Emily's mind went blank. She had no idea what could have happened to her son at his grandmother's house. "I don't know. He was staying at my mother's house. I'll ask her." Dr. Jenkins didn't soften his serious expression. "Emily, I'm legally obligated to report this situation. This type of injury suggests the possibility of abuse. We need to call the police immediately." Emily couldn't get up from her chair. The word abuse was echoing in her head. She couldn't accept the reality that her son might have been hurt by someone. "But my mother would never hurt Ethan." "Emily, we need to get to the truth. Ethan's safety is the top priority." An hour later, Detective Ali arrived at the hospital. He was an experienced investigator specializing in child abuse. Emily explained in a trembling voice the circumstances of Ethan staying at his grandmother's house. "Was there anyone else at your mother's place?" "My mother's new boyfriend, a man named Robert McNeil. They had a special dinner last night." Detective Ali took detailed notes. "Let's go to your mother's house right away. We need to hear her side of the story." Emily sat by her son's bedside and held his small hand. Ethan seemed a little better with the pain medication, but his consciousness was still not clear. "Mama is here. Everything is going to be all right now," she whispered to her son while telling herself the same thing. However, deep in her heart, she knew that nothing was all right anymore. At 3 p.m, Emily went to her mother's house with the police officer. During the drive, she was considering various possibilities. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe Ethan had fallen down the stairs. However, Dr. Jenkins's words wouldn't leave her head. This type of injury was caused by intentional violence. When they arrived at her mother's house, Emily noticed something strange. The living room lights that were usually visible from the window weren't on. There was no car in the parking lot either. Detective Ali rang the doorbell, but there was no response. "No one seems to be here." The detective tried to peer through the windows, but the curtains were closed, and the inside couldn't be seen. Emily knew where the hidden key was, but she couldn't enter the house without legal procedures. "Please try to contact your mother." Emily took out her cell phone and called her mother's number. However, the phone went to voicemail. She suggested talking to the neighbors. The resident of the neighboring house, Mrs. Eldridge, was a woman in her 70s who had lived in this area for many years. "Margaret left early this morning with a man. She had a big suitcase, so I thought maybe she was going on a trip." Emily's blood ran cold. The fact that her mother had disappeared with Robert suggested the worst possibility. At that moment, her cell phone rang. It was a call from Margaret. Emily answered the phone with trembling hands. "Mom, where are you?" "Ethan is..." "Emily, I'm sorry." Margaret's voice sounded like she was crying. "I can't explain, but I don't want to lose him." The phone was disconnected. Emily stood there in stunned silence. It took time to understand the meaning of her mother's words. Her mother knew the truth, and she had chosen her relationship with Robert over that truth. Detective Ali continued questioning the neighbors. Mrs. Eldridge's testimony confirmed that Margaret and Robert had left early in the morning with luggage. Emily repeated her mother's last phone call words over and over in her head. The weight of the words, "I don't want to lose him," gradually pressed down on her heart. "Mrs. Thompson, could you show us your mother's room? We'll process the search warrant, but as an emergency, if you consent, we can examine it first." Emily reluctantly agreed in order to know the truth about her son. When they entered the house with the hidden key, the living room still showed remnants of the previous night's dinner. However, looking carefully, one of the wine glasses on the table was chipped, and the fragments remained unswept near the fireplace. Entering Margaret's bedroom, Emily realized that her mother's life had changed significantly. On the dresser were unfamiliar perfume bottles and expensive-looking jewelry. After the divorce, her mother was definitely trying to find a new self. When she opened the bedside table drawer, Emily's hands trembled. There were many letters from Robert McNeil. The first letters were kind and gentlemanly in content, but as they got to more recent dates, the content changed. "Margaret, your grandson doesn't seem to understand our relationship. Children are adaptable. He might need stricter discipline." Something cold flowed through Emily's veins. As she read further, more explicit content continued. "Last night when Ethan interrupted our conversation, I raised my voice a little. I understand that you're upset, but children need to be taught boundaries. My method seemed to be effective." Detective Ali entered the room. Emily handed him the letter with trembling hands. "Please read this." After reading the letter, the detective looked at Emily with a serious expression. "This will be important evidence. This man clearly has violent tendencies. Do you think your mother knew about these contents?" Emily was at a loss for an answer. If her mother had continued the relationship knowing Robert's true nature, it would mean she had put her son in danger. However, as a daughter, she couldn't completely understand the psychology of a woman drowning in love. From the back of the closet, Emily made another discovery. There was a suitcase that seemed to belong to Robert's personal belongings. Inside, along with men's clothing, were prescription medicine bottles. Looking at the names of the medicines, Emily understood from her knowledge as a nurse that they were psychiatric stabilizers and antidepressants. However, the name on the prescription was not Robert McNeil, but Robert Johnson. "Detective, please look at this." Detective Ali examined the medicine bottles and contacted headquarters by radio. The possibility of a false name became apparent, and Robert's identity investigation became urgent. At that moment, Emily's cell phone rang. It was a call from the hospital. "Ethan has woken up. He's in a condition where he can talk." Emily and Detective Ali rushed back to the hospital. Ethan was conscious but still complaining of a headache. Seeing his small body crouched on the bed, Emily's heart felt like it was about to break. "Ethan, it's Mama. How do you feel?" "Mama, I was scared." Ethan's voice was small, and he was clearly frightened. Detective Ali spoke to her son in a gentle tone. "Ethan, I'm Detective Ali. I want to make sure you're safe. Can you tell me what happened at Grandma's house?" Ethan began to speak little by little while holding his mother's hand. "Uncle Robert came and had dinner with Grandma, but I spilled water. And then Uncle Robert got angry. He made a scary face and grabbed my arm hard. Grandma tried to stop him, but..." Ethan continued with tears in his eyes. "After that, when I was crying, Uncle Robert said, 'Shut up,' and hit my head." Emily wanted to hug her son but restrained herself and continued listening calmly. What was Grandma doing? Grandma was crying, but she said, "I'm sorry to Uncle Robert, not to me, but to Uncle Robert." That testimony deeply hurt Emily's heart. Her mother had prioritized her lover's mood over her son's pain. Detective Ali gently continued. "Ethan, what happened after that?" Uncle Robert went downstairs with Grandma. "I was alone in the room crying. My head hurt so much, but nobody came." Ethan's testimony revealed the full scope of the incident. Robert had physically hit her son, and Margaret hadn't been able to stop it. And while her son was suffering, the two of them were talking downstairs. Around 6 in the evening, Detective Ali received a call from headquarters. Robert McNeil was a false name, and his real name was Robert Johnson. It was discovered that he had previous convictions for domestic violence and child abuse. He was also currently wanted in another state. Do you have any idea where they might have gone? Emily thought desperately. Places her mother had talked about. Places of memories. Places to escape to. Maybe Vermont, where my mother's sister lives. My Aunt Carol and she were close. At that moment, Emily's cell phone rang again. It was from Margaret. Emily followed the detective's instructions and put the call on recording mode before answering. Mom, where are you? Emily, I made a mistake. Margaret's voice was wet with tears. Robert is not the person I thought he was, but at the time I was afraid of losing him. I couldn't protect Ethan. Mom, where are you now? Ethan is in the hospital. He injured his head. I know. I'm sorry. I'm the worst grandmother. Margaret let out a sob. Robert says he's going to run away. He told me to come with him, but I can't follow him anymore. I can't stay with someone who hurt Ethan. Mom, turn yourself in to the police right now. Emily, Robert has a weapon. I'm trying to escape from him, but if something happens, tell Ethan. Tell him that Grandma loves him. The phone was disconnected. Detective Alley immediately contacted headquarters and instructed coordination with Vermont police. At 10 at night, good news finally arrived. Margaret was taken into protective custody by a patrol car on a Vermont highway. Robert was arrested, and Margaret had minor injuries but was not in life-threatening condition. The next morning, Margaret came to the hospital under police escort. Although she wasn't handcuffed, she was accompanied by a police officer. In front of Ethan's bed, grandmother and grandson quietly faced each other. Ethan, Grandma did something wrong. I couldn't protect you, and I'm truly sorry. Margaret took her grandson's small hand and shed tears. Grandma, do you still like me? At Ethan's innocent question, Margaret choked up. Of course. Grandma loves you more than anyone in the world. That's exactly why I can't forgive myself for hurting you. Emily was enveloped in complex emotions as she watched the interaction between her mother and son. Whether she should forgive her mother or pursue responsibility for putting her son in danger, the answer wouldn't come easily. 3 months later, autumn sunlight gently illuminated the living room of Emily's apartment. Ethan was spreading Lego blocks on the floor, building a small castle. His head injury had completely healed, and his bright smile had returned. But the mature expression he occasionally showed revealed the depth of the impact that incident had on him. Robert Johnson was prosecuted on multiple charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Margaret received 6 months of probation for aiding and abetting child abuse. While it was a light sentence legally, the guilt she carried was heavier than any punishment. Emily began visiting Margaret every Thursday. Her mother had sold her previous house and started living alone in a small apartment. The luxurious furniture had been disposed of, and the room with only simple daily necessities was in stark contrast to its former splendor. How is Ethan? Margaret always started with the same question. Her eyes held a mixture of deep regret and unchanging love for her grandson. Yes, he's enjoying school. However, Emily started to say something and stopped. She was unsure whether to tell her mother that Ethan sometimes woke up from nightmares in the middle of the night. Ethan, who was receiving counseling, was definitely recovering, but it would take time to return completely to normal. It's my fault, Margaret murmured softly. I scarred that child's life. Emily took her mother's hand. Mom, you were a victim too. You were deceived by Robert. No, Emily. I overlooked the warning signs. No, I pretended not to see them. I noticed that Ethan was reluctant, but I prioritized my own happiness. Margaret's voice was filled with deep self-loathing. It was true that the loneliness after divorce had dulled her judgment. Starved for Robert's kindness, she had chosen the fear of losing her lover over her son's safety. A month ago, Emily made an important decision during a counseling session. She decided to allow Ethan and Margaret to reunite. Of course, it was under Emily's supervision, but she wondered whether completely severing family bonds would be good for her son. The first reunion was filled with tension. Ethan stiffened in front of Margaret and immediately hid behind his mother. However, when Margaret quietly repeated her words of apology and promised never to put him in danger again, her grandson's heart gradually opened. "Grandma, bad people won't come anymore, right?" At Ethan's innocent question, Margaret answered while holding back tears. "They absolutely won't come. Grandma will never again have a relationship with anyone who would make you sad. Your safety is the most important thing." Now, once a month, the three of them met in the park. Margaret treasured her time with her grandson and never again took any rash actions like before. She received counseling, learned how to deal with loneliness, and looked at herself anew. For Emily, forgiving her mother wasn't easy. The fact that her son had been put in danger remained unchanged. However, she also understood that even she, who aimed to be a perfect mother, sometimes made wrong judgments. What was important was learning from mistakes and never repeating the same errors. One evening, Ethan said to Emily, "Mama, I still like Grandma, but this time I'm going to protect Grandma." In those words, Emily felt her son's growth, while also feeling the sadness that a child shouldn't have to carry such a burden. As autumn deepened, Emily made a new decision. While it would take time to completely repair the relationship with her mother, she decided to acknowledge that Ethan had the right to have a bond with his grandmother. However, this time she intended to build the relationship carefully and gradually. Margaret learned to prioritize family over romance. Emily learned that trust can be lost in an instant, but with love, it can be rebuilt over time. And Ethan learned that adults make mistakes too, but people who truly love you will always apologize and try to change. A true family is not built on blood relations alone. What creates the true bonds of family is a relationship where people protect each other, acknowledge their mistakes, and forgive each other. The three of them came to understand this through their pain. Outside the window, a new season was quietly beginning.